I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening. This is, I warmly welcome our in-person audience and, of course, our online audience as well. Tonight's talk, The History, Art and Design of Linoleum, Never Before, Forever, with Professor Christina P. For those of you less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profitable organization that was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the City of New York. Today, our 238-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our General Society Library, of course, of which we're in this evening, the John M. Mossman Locke Museum, and for those of you who this may be your first visit in person, you are welcome to visit it after the lecture tonight. And finally, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which this lecture is part of. For the online audience, we ask that you use the Q&A section to submit questions rather than raise your hand or use the chat section. For the in-person audience, we ask that you save your questions to the conclusion of the talk. Tonight, our speaker, Christina P. who will be sharing her great expertise on materials and fibers and her fascinating research in linoleum and how it relates to her art practice. We so appreciate that she traveled down from Philadelphia, especially to give this lecture. Professor Day's art practice alchemizes roles related to material lifespan, designer, fabricator, owner, maintainer. She's based in Philadelphia, PA, and is a full-time faculty member of the Fiber Department at Maryland Institute College of Art, which of course is in Baltimore, where her teachings focus on cloth production methods and experimental fashion. Recent art exhibitions have been held at Fleischer Art Memorial, Hesse Plateau Gallery, Whitesbog Village, and Mount Airy Contemporary, and I do apologize if I've mispronounced any of those words. She is an alumna of the University of Arts and Cranbrook Academy of Art and has participated in art residencies at the Sculpture Park, Vermont Studio Center, Haystack Open Studio Residency, RAIR, and the studios at MASS, MOCA. It is such a pleasure to be able to introduce to you Christina. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're entering what in educational circles we might call the high flex. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that phrase, but that means that you're speaking to people in the room and online at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to keep you entertained with the pictures that I have here. There's a wide range of things I'm going to be showing, so I just want to say thank you for coming in. Thank you to all the people that I know that are online who have reached out to me today. I'm looking right at the camera to say thank you for being here. Welcome to today's lecture on the history of linoleum. My name is Christina P. and I'm really thrilled to be here. I'd like to extend my thanks to the staff at the General Society for Mechanics and Tradesmen for the opportunity to share the research I have completed on the history of linoleum and its relationship to my art practice. Every time I am given the chance to collect my thoughts on things like this, I gain a lot of insight. I hope this presentation sheds light on the history common materials hold in our day-to-day lives. I am excited to share this enthusiasm with you that I have for this topic. To get started, we'll begin here. This talk is about linoleum, but it is not a technical talk. I teach at the undergraduate fiber department of the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, Maryland. For those that might not be familiar with the medium, fiber is an area of study in art that centers on the context of making and using cloth. My approach to the medium is informed by being both an artist and a technician in the field. How something is made is as meaningful as what it communicates in the end. This sentiment is reflected in the process-based classes that I teach at MICA on cloth production and experimental fashion. So how did I make it to this topic when I am coming from an area of study that is about textiles? Fiber is a medium that reaches into a lot of places beyond fine art, because textiles and the patterns that make them are things we live with and around every day. I found my interest in linoleum because of its relationship to interior architectural surface and history. As we identify fashion as a thing we wear, linoleum is quite literally fashion for a home. As I found the material surfacing in my studio practice, it was a logical step for me to trace the pattern back to where it came from. What is linoleum? A water-resistant, long-lasting type of flooring made of a combination of oxidized linseed oil, cork dust, wood flour, pine resin, ground limestone, and pigment that is pressed into a woven backing made from jute, a natural plant fiber. Where does the name come from? Coined by bookmaker Frederick Walton, the word linoleum is based on the words linum, which stands for flax, and oleum, oil, in this case, the linseed oil, the basis for linoleum cement. The word linoleum is considered to be the first product name to have become a generic term, like Kleenex, Q-tip, and Saran wrap. It is a word that survives history and is one that we still find in use today, though what we find stateside these days is not necessarily linoleum, but vinyl flooring, a later invention to make a more resilient version of linoleum. What partially precipitated the transition to vinyl flooring? The popularity of women's high-heeled shoes. For those who might remember the times, I know my mother actually recounted a story to me of her being in college and being asked to put these little plastic caps on her heels to prevent the heels from dinging the floor. So if you've seen or ever had to renovate linoleum out of a house, you probably see pock marks all over the flooring, and it's from the high-heeled shoes. What is the story of how this came to pass? This is a quote from Pamela H. Simpson, who wrote, or this is an article actually that was called Substitute Gimcrackery. Legend has it that one day the young Frederick Walton noticed a skin of oxidized linseed oil coating a jar of paint. He peeled it off and began playing with the rubber-like substance, thinking of ways to use it. Why was this on his mind? The presence of a product in the market at the time named kamptulicon. Kamptulicon, a name derived from the Greek words kamptos, which stands for flexible, and ulos, standing for thick, was a floor covering made from powdered cork and natural rubber. Patented by Elijah Galloway in 1843, kamptulicon was first launched in public at the 1862 International Exhibition in London, where it caused a sensation. The craze was short-lived, though, when a combination of limited palette, the rubber made colors dark, and significant increases in the price of natural rubber caused the industry to fold. Enter Frederick Walton with a, quote, new innovation on an already established idea. This is a timeline for context for you to think about it, because this material is a lot older than people realize. In this era of the flooring industry in the UK, oilcloth was the primary product of choice for interior carpet substitutes, save the short-lived craze of kamptulicon. In 1862, kamptulicon debuts at the 1862 International Exhibition in London. In 1864, Walton discovers his linoleum recipe and sets up a factory in England to produce flooring products. His recipe created prints that had a palette lighter in color than kamptulicon, which met growing public interest in wider color offerings. By 1866, this is just 4 years later, the Linoleum Manufacturing Company reports steady sales. Then by 1869, linoleum was exported to the United States and beyond. Here's the incoming problem. In 1876, Walton's patent expired, and the name was immediately adopted by his Scottish imitators. Though Walton took Michael Nairn, another flooring industrialist, to court for this, he lost his own case, and ownership of the word linoleum, which then became public property. These two were clearly not friends, as you can see. Aside from competing companies making similar products, the popularity of linoleum emerged by way of technological advances of the times and a growing middle class. It could be readily distributed by an improved system of mass transportation within the UK, and a demand was sparked by the emergence of large-scale targeted advertising to home-owning middle-class women in both the UK and the United States. So let's take a look at the materiality of linoleum. The following lantern slides are from the Armstrong Flooring Company of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. These were found when I had an exploratory fellowship at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware this past fall. I just want to make a point For those of you, if you've ever, or if you've never encountered a lantern slide presentation before, or if you ever hear of a public presentation happening with lantern slides, you should go, because it's like the world's oldest version of a PowerPoint, literally. This is raw, unprocessed cork from the tree. These are really beautiful objects, by the way. Lantern slides are about the size of your palm when you're holding them in your hand, and they're as sharp as they can be of a picture, which is really beautiful. Here we have cork bark that's bundled together. Ground cork dust, so that's been processed a little bit further along to make it kind of like a flower inside the recipe. And then we have the linoleum cement, which, as you can see, is this large, thick, bendable piece of oxidized and mixed material. Note the flexibility. A woven backing of jute fiber is at the back of this material, and this is how you recognize it as the original linoleum, because there's actually woven fabric on the back. This holds the linoleum recipe in a mosaic form, oxidized, and this is what's on the inside of the material. Oxidized linseed oil, cork dust again, wood flour, pine resin, ground limestone, and pigments. This is a fragment that you're looking at of a specific type of linoleum called mosaic linoleum, which was puzzled together to make this pattern. Take special note of the fabric, because I'm going to take a second to talk about this. Before we address the jute as a crucial part of the recipe of the linoleum trade, it is important to talk about Scottish linen production and how it set the stage for the creation of linoleum. Now we're going to enter a brief processing interlude, and I'm going to take you to class, because this is what we talk about in the fiber department. So how we might recognize linen today, shown here as bedding. This is a fiber that is found in the fashion and interiors industry. It is a lightweight, breathable fiber that is comfortable directly against the skin. But before we receive it in this processed woven form, it enters the world like this. I don't know if you've ever gotten a chance to see a flowering field of flax, but this is the plant of origin of linen, which is pretty amazing. It's harvested after 100 days of growth, and this bloom only lasts 1 day. Isn't that a beautiful flower? What a surprise that it's purple. How is it possible to get yarn from a plant? Linen fibers surround the core of the flax plant in the same manner of this image of the canaf fiber. This is actually a really wonderful diagram, a cross section explaining all the parts that are in the actual stalk. So the pectin bound bast fiber, which is the outer rim of it, is the part where the fiber is actually coming from. The explanation here that I have written is the cellulose fiber of the linen is made from the strong bast fibers that form the outer bark of the flax plant. Bast fibers, by means of a series of processing steps, are separated from the wetter plant matter before being spun together to make yarn. Other popular bast fibers are hemp, bamboo, jute, and canaf. A saying we use in the fiber department at MICA to talk about spun material and its journey to become cloth. This is courtesy of Professor Susie Brandt, who is probably watching this online right now. And I want you to think about this for a second, because this is really accurate. Stuff to line, line to plane, plane to form. Processing flax. First, a separation of seed pod from harvested plant. Flax seed pods are separated, dried, and processed for either food safe or industrial applications. Then a division of where the products are headed moves into either food grade use or what would be called industrial grade use. Food grade would take you to flax seeds and oil. You might have this at home in your cupboard. Food safe flaxseed oil is typically produced by cold pressing the seeds of the flax plant, meaning that heat and chemicals are not used in the extraction of the oil. This is food safe grade and is often used as a dietary supplement for reducing inflammation. Industrial grade, however, goes in a very different direction. Perhaps you are wondering if flaxseed oil and linseed oil are the same thing. They are not. Linseed oil also involves pressing flax seeds, but petroleum solvents are used during extraction to maximize yield. This is why you will see it sold in a hardware store and used as a natural stain for wood. Most definitely not edible. Taking the harvested flax plant to the next stage, which is called retting. Retting is a process employing the action of microorganisms and moisture on plants to dissolve or rot away much of the cellular tissues and pectins surrounding bast fibers, making it easier to separate the spinnable fiber from the stem and getting it closer to the state of yarn. Softening stages, creating flax straw. Flax straw is beaten between top and base of a brake tool, breaking the woody core down. Fibers are then pulled through blades on a base and lid in a process called scutching. Last stage before spinning is called hackling. Hackles are made of several parallel rows of metal pins set in wood. This splits the flax into individual fibers, separating the long line fibers from the short toe fibers. The result is what we call flax strick. Flax strick. Now note, these are the 3 stages of how it might look, where it's plant matter, strick, and then yarn. I thought this picture was kind of interesting because it shows you how it's getting finer along the way. Dressing a distaff stool with flax strick, much like the state of a cotton swab or Q-tip, and then spinning the line from the distaff to create a single line of yarn. Now, I want to point out this map that I have here of Scotland, of the UK at large, but I'm pointing to 2 arrows of cities of Kirkcaldy and Dundee in this picture for a reason. When jute came to Scotland as a material, the linen trade was already underway in Kirkcaldy and Dundee. In the 18th century, a problem with the supply of flax coincided with the British East India Company looking to bring raw jute back from India, a British colony. In 1793, the British East India Company exported the first consignment of 100 tons of raw jute from India to Scotland. Eventually, Dundee received this, and flax spinners in the area began experimenting with the mechanical processing of jute on their tools that had been made from flax. By 1830, Dundee spinners modified their power-driven machinery to spin jute, creating a jump in production and paving a way for the flooring industry of the area to gain international traction. Now, having seen the steps in a single line setting for flax processing, imagine what the Industrial Revolution did to this process for jute. Using the linen mills already powered by water in Dundee, Scotland, by 1833, jute fiber was mechanically spun in Dundee. Jute's long staple and high tensile strength made it suitable for a wider range of applications than linen, which eventually led to it being used in automobiles, upholstery, and home furnishings, and in this particular case, linoleum. A colonial relationship with the UK that the UK had with India and Pakistan, both major suppliers of jute and flax and affiliated labor, accelerated production. The material that came to back linoleum, jute. You might recognize this somewhat looking like bamboo. No, that was the first reaction that I had when I saw this picture. Again, a division in processing, making full use of the plant. Harvested jute leaves are commonly used in Indian, Southeast Asian, West African, and Middle Eastern diets. The mineral-rich leaves are used fresh or dried as a thickening agent in soups, stews, and curries. Harvesting jute, a process parallel to flax. To reach the bast material of the jute fiber for textile use, harvested plants are kept in a field for about 3 days for the leaves to shed away. Bundles are then submerged in water in a retting process. Here we have a picture of bundled retted jute closer to a spinnable state, and spun jute. You've probably encountered this in a hardware store anywhere in the United States. So let's consider this sample again and how much work it took to only make the back. What got me started on this research? Pandemic teaching and a realization about my relationship to archives. With teaching that reach into architecture, photography, textiles, and poetry, my art practice requires multiple modes of study. I am a maker and a materials person first. I seek found materials to work with that hold a quality of person and place. These interests have led me to explore the givens in the materials I use. This research dive has taught me that valuable archives live on all kinds of levels, from junkyards and flea markets to specially cared for libraries. What have I learned? There is no such thing as a neutral material. The classroom pre-pandemic. In the fiber department, we have sort of an all hands on deck way of teaching if you're talking about weaving or printing or dyeing, all the modes of how you get cloth into this world. Everybody learns it at the same time. You learn the tools that it takes to make them. Sometimes you have to make the tool to do the thing. That's another thing I'll talk about later. I just wanted to acknowledge this though, that this is how it was in the room, where everybody would take the tools out and handle them and physically engage. And that changed significantly when we were online, because the school that I work for at MICA did go online for a full year. So we were teaching people how to sew through the computer, how to print in your kitchen, things like that. It was almost impossible, but it happened. The pandemic changed how I talked about materials, production, and process. This is a picture taken in a class that I have taught in the past called Surface Resist Dyeing, which is sort of like for lack of a better term, like a boot camp class in dyeing, where you learn how to change the color of all kinds of materials in the class. And one of the exercises we do is to paint the entire rainbow in one day of every single color that exists in one particular type of dye. And then we do it again a few months later to explore how different fibers receive the different types of dye. So there's a lot of technical info in those classes. In 2015, I was awarded a standard residency at RAIR, an art residency situated within a sorting facility in Northeast Philadelphia that receives over 250 tons of waste material a day. For 3 months, I was able to sift through material and observe the circumstances that lead to a material's demise. My current body of work has me looking for duplicates at different times and places and conjoining them into sculptural forms, a process that can often take years. While I was at RAIR, my definition of what I thought a match was widened. Looking for literal duplicates shifted to finding a likeness or an echo. I was surprised by what this did to my artwork. The way I handle materials is still affected by this realization. This is a picture of me looking at the junkyard, which is basically like a yard that receives everything from 1-800 Junk trucks that pull in, tip the whole thing back, and everything comes sliding out to all kinds of things that come from house demolition. It's hard to explain how massive this pile is, but it changes on the hour every day because of the big machinery that's moving things around. You have to wear high-vis clothing when you're in that landscape because there's literally a process of breakdown happening in front of you. It's a really unique place for an art residency to be situated because you're watching things happen that are never going to be there again. I had a very strong reaction to that as an artist. So here I balance teaching in the classroom and this at the same time. The following images give some context to what my art practice looks like at large. Over the years, I have moved back and forth between architecture and fashion as I consider both to be a mirror for person and place. False Fit was made from broken salvage found on site at RAIR. After making this, I observed a dialogue between the cut lines, the ones I found as is, meaning the sharp lines that came out of the excavation, the house that it was taken from, versus the ones that I added in working into the surface. When I am working intuitively back into materials in this anomalous kind of way, I am after an effect that saves and subjugates at once. In different ways since then, this residency has had an impact on my art practice in a way that it has me thinking about alchemy, meaning that alchemizing roles related to material production, designer, fabricator, owner, maintainer. Architectural surfaces for me hold a kind of charge. Dents, scars, and physical stains of previous ownership speak to the mirror materials can become over time. Refined construction is something I intentionally spend time on. Splint was made in response to a job I once had working on a historic preservation team in Philadelphia, restoring turn-of-the-century trims and window frames. The center seam of the piece has a mirror image break of wallpaper that matches, turning the window into a forced perspective opening from the center. Travelers, a triplicate of repeating form, is made from 8 pairs of almost identical sets of pocket opera glasses. Using the logic of a repeat pattern that links to itself to continue, my goal was to restart an object's anachronistic condition to think for itself. I'm often interested in objects that serve as surrogates for a body. In 2016, I exhibited a large-scale architectural installation at Q Art Foundation here in New York City, where I built a site-specific installation based on found family footage of a golden anniversary party I had attended as a child at a VFW hall in Long Island. A family move unearthed forgotten video footage that had been taken at this party, and for me, this was a special reanimation of family members that have long since been gone. Surfaces within the openings, which were only wide enough for one viewer at a time, were covered in dated aesthetics and wall treatments to seal off a space from another time. The video camera left unattended for long periods of time to just record the party was frequently bumped into and left to focus on random perimeters of the room. I built long sightlines into this piece that were an interpretation of this footage. The center of attention in each sightline is beyond what can be seen. The footage has yellowed in time, which served as an inspiration for the overall aesthetic of the piece. In one amazing moment in this footage, a moment was caught of my father taking a picture of the video camera. It is highly likely that another family member who hated getting her picture taken was on the other side of this image. That's a shout out to my Aunt Phil. I learned a long time ago that I have a strong reaction to photography for the way it hardens mutual sightlines into a memory experience between photographer and subject. I will always respond to this action that holds for a view of a second of another time and place that I can no longer access. Materiality has always played an important role in the meaning of my work. I went to undergrad for a degree in crafts and a concentration in fiber at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. It was there that I learned how to consider craft as a way of working and thinking. How something is made participates in the meaning of what it is. Cascade, also made in response to the found family footage, is made from a naturally ambered vinyl seat cover that I also found in the junkyard at RAIR. This color is not cosmetic, but rather a capture of natural age on a synthetic material. Though I spent many an hour on this piece, I did not realize until it was mounted and lit that I had created a piece that was a projection itself, an unexpected outcome in tune with how film ages. My visual vocabulary comes from working into materials until they talk back to me. This quick tabletop collage I made from broken vinyl parquet tiles left me thinking about what happens if a broken, lost material wakes back up and blinks. Pattern multiplication and consideration for what is called the jog line, or seam between repeats, continues to inform decisions that I make. What is a repeat pattern? A repeat pattern is a design in which lines, shapes, and forms or colors are repeated as a pattern extends. A single element that is repeated is called a motif, and the seam line that demarcates this repeat is called a jog line. There are many types of patterns. Full drop, the repeat unit is created by stacking the original repeat block in a grid format. Then you have a half drop. A repeat unit is stacked vertically in a column format, which is then offset by half in the next vertical row, creating a diagonal orientation. A diamond pattern, which is stacked in a diamond-shaped diagonal formation. And then you have random, which is patterns are scattered within the repeat unit, which creates organic and nonlinear design. This was found in Philadelphia, but how did it get here? This is a large piece of linoleum, vinyl flooring. Working with linoleum as an art material. In 2018, after collecting a good deal of broken linoleum from various places, I began cutting, stacking, and collaging visual elements to create floral and tectonic effects with the material. Roser was inspired by both bridal and funereal floral arrangements, somewhere in between metaphors about renovation and capture. Hung vertically and framed under glass, the piece is reminiscent of the way flowers are pressed between glass. The way RAIR was built speaks to the nature of renovation, breaking and building between a before and after. This first picture was taken from overhead, so you could see how the pattern was breaking and multiplying. But the piece actually rests flat on a low table surface to emphasize the tectonic nature of the breaks and repeats, as if the pattern itself is repeating to be put back together again. Spray is shaped in the likeness of a casket cover, carefully pierced and cut to create a frozen floral form that sits in an arrangement. These pieces were cut entirely by blade and scissor. The original material was sourced from a home demolition project in South Philadelphia. And I just want to say, you might wonder how, because this is an intensely cut piece, that's a lot of time that was put into this. I'm just going to say that when I was on those administrative Zoom calls and the camera was off, this is what I was doing. Sorry, Micah, if you're watching this. I know the whole community is like, what did she just say? Okay, so push is a nod to spring, but in an ever dead kind of way. This material will literally never break down. My relationship to how things are made reflects in the way I work surfaces and materials. And so this brings me to a desire that came to me during the pandemic to do deeper homework about the materials I am drawn to, which started with this amazing book by art historian Pamela H. Simpson. Cheap, quick, and easy imitative architectural materials from 1870 to 1930 goes into depth about the history of several trades that mark a shift from real to faux in the materials of concrete, tin ceilings, wood paneling, faux finishings, and linoleum. The interesting thing about seeking specific information like this is that you can suddenly find yourself on a continuum line in time and space with others who find the same exact content exciting. I can't recommend this book enough for those that might take interest in this. The image that launched this research, which was in this book, it's a processing of something called inlaid mosaic linoleum. The origin of this image was from the Kirkcaldy Museum in Northern Scotland. So this is why it's important to look at other academic things that have been written, because there's a lot of information about what has already been done, what's already been found, which is where I sort of picked up with where I was going. Why did this happen? Because this was happening at my desk as I came across this image. I think in another time and space, I would have been one of those workers at the table. In September of this past year, I was awarded an exploratory grant to support my linoleum research at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, a special museum and library dedicated to American invention. For those of you in the decorative arts circles, Hagley has connections to Winterthur. I strongly recommend visiting their museum in person or online to see the amazing collection of patent models they have on display that speak to ingenuity and context. For a particular period of time, the US Patent Office used to require that scale models were made by inventors seeking patents. This practice stopped after they could no longer store the objects. And this museum has this unbelievable archive of what I would refer to as accidental sculpture. It's amazing. So if you find yourself in Wilmington, please go, and you can write me and tell me later that you loved it, because you will. Faced with a deep archive of images and other people's words tucked into books that haven't been opened for a long while, it's interesting to think about what you are having a reaction to when you need to see or read something twice. For a week, I worked in a very different kind of way from what I normally do in the studio, and spent hours looking through trade catalogs, factory books, and process imagery, which helped to fill in gaps of how linoleum was made, who made it, and the stages of processing it took to be produced. As I was going through resources that were pulled for me, I was struck by a feeling I had had before as a builder on historic preservation sites, repointing bricks on a roof line. When you are looking through an archive, you can find yourself suddenly on that continuum line that I was talking about before, where you're suddenly physically in the same position as somebody else who did the same job a long time ago. I had a very strong response to that when I was physically doing it, and I felt it again when I was in this archive. So again, go to your local archives because they're amazing, and there's a lot of legwork that's living in these shelves. This is why these are here. They're waiting for you to come and ask them questions. I'm currently in the midst of my first academic sabbatical, so to dive further into what I had uncovered at Hagley, I coordinated a trip to continue the research abroad, which led me to the origin of the trade in Kirkcaldy, Scotland. Here is a map a little zoomed in closer on Scotland to show Kirkcaldy's proximity to Edinburgh, but also to point out how close both cities were to the water. This is important to pay attention to for factory power. This is the Kirkcaldy Museum, which has an archive of over 6,000 samples of linoleum. Kirkcaldy is the home of the linoleum trade, quite literally. I reached out to curator Lily Barnes, and we collaborated on a list of things I was looking to view in person to fill in the gaps from what I had encountered at Hagley. I was able to visit the Glenrothes archive at Bankhead, which is an offsite archive for the Kirkcaldy Museum, because you can imagine the building you just saw would never be able to hold 6,000 samples of linoleum. Most ironically, this facility was located in a former Amazon warehouse. Can we just take that in for a second? Like, as linoleum being a widely spread product, there's something ironic about that, is there not? For those of you who've never seen archives like this before, those yellow shelves that you're looking at in this picture are on a system that they have to be wheeled out of the way of each other. So when you know which item you're looking for, they press special buttons to drive the shelves away, and you can go down certain lanes to look for certain objects. This is an archive gem in a lot of ways. It also requires an amazing amount of work to keep all of that organized. Interesting things happen when you're seeking answers to specific questions. This archive is a treasure trove of materials that speak to the history of Kirkcaldy and trade pattern books to actual tools to linoleum fragments. This is a fraction of what I saw when I was there, but I just wanted to give you a sense. When you ask specific questions, sometimes things can be pulled that will really answer what you're looking for. Here is a traveling salesman kit, which shows the materiality of linoleum in the stages of its processing. Note the fourth vial in is a white container. That's the oxidized linseed oil, which had a white base. This created a significantly wider palette of flooring options. You see how involved this is, how many parts it takes to make the whole. A question I had come in with, though, from the start was, why did linoleum have a pixelated aesthetic? Given the age of its production, we could say that this aesthetic is proto-digital, but actually those of us who work in textiles know that computer programming with its binary coding language is actually based on textile drafts, further endorsing my point that everything points back to textiles because they are awesome, but I digress. When I first came across this digital effect, it hadn't occurred to me that the design was actually meant to imitate a carpet pile. That's why it looks like that. I came to confirm after encountering a trade school how-to book for training students from 1905 that the visual language of ticking in, which is a drafting practice associated with weave structures, was carried over to the aesthetic of linoleum print design for flooring to create a substitute for an actual carpet. Imitative architecture indeed. Interestingly, in weaving classes at MICA, we still teach this same practice of doing a drawdown to forecast a pattern before it is realized in materials. The grid represents a map of warp and weft activity, and how a cell is filled in speaks to the behavior of the thread, up or down, 0 or 1. I knew this practice of drafting was as old as weaving itself, but I was struck by the contemporary for its time nature of this design practice as linoleum pattern was being designed. Because in a way here, what we are looking at is a composite of two trades, one to describe the activity of the woven ground on a loom, and the other to direct how to split the pattern into color separations per print. A quote I am demi-haunted by from the ICS Reference Library Student Handbook of 1905, or as I like to call it, the mutual insult, a guide to designing for book covers, carpet, oilcloth, and wallpaper. I'm going to read all of these because these quotes are amazing. The designer must be able to produce 3 classes of designs. 1, designs that are good floor covering, pleasing in form, and harmonious in the theory of design to suit the public that is educated and knows what a design should be. 2, where elaborate floral devices in bunches or strewn in garlands form the principle in outline in loud and contrasting colors that a certain number of uneducated people can best get their money's worth in noise and brilliancy. Opinions, anyone? Right? A class of design for the great middle class that knows that these florid and ostentatious designs are in bad taste, but that does not feel itself equal to the appreciation of the first lot and therefore must be content with simple, unoffensive patterns whose main virtue lies in the fact that even though one cannot say they are good, he cannot say they are very bad. With no shortage of opinion, the book goes on to say, there is nothing in these designs to positively recommend the beauty of color or design, and their good qualities are of a negative character. That is, they possess no forms of sufficient importance to make one stop and think whether or not he likes them. It is the public that buys, and the manufacturer must prepare goods to suit all classes. It cannot be argued from this that the public is any more familiar with the rules for floor coverings than it is with other details of fine art, but there is no doubt that a sufficient number of the public have that feeling of uneasiness in the presence of a bad pattern to cause the rush in favor of the better goods. I couldn't stop thinking about that, by the way, because I love a spicy opinion when I find one, especially from 1905. During this visit, I also got to visit with the great grandparent of the linoleum trade, which is oilcloth. This was particularly special as these materials have largely degraded over time and are very hard to come by in person. What is oilcloth? A close woven waterproof linen cloth printed with pigments and coated with boiled linseed oil. So we saw pictures of that earlier. This is like the first version of like waterproof flooring that you're looking at. The following images are included for those among us who might be intrigued by the process of how things get made. I know I had a strong response to these images because of the people in them. Tool maintenance spans time and space. This is the same stance a screen printer takes in front of a washout sink. When I see pictures like this, I am struck by the sight lines of the space, the weather, the temperature, the clothing, and for the love of all things good, the pattern that is just casually advancing through the space. Because of the surprising correlation my artwork had to a specific type of linoleum that was produced, mosaic or inlaid linoleum, I began to specifically search for images of how the material was made in a factory setting. I learned through my research that there was more than one way to make inlaid linoleum because companies were competing. Here, filtered pigmented cork dust was mashed through zinc frames. The results were baked and then left in place to cure. The tray that the arrow is pointing to is the cork dust, and there's more than one of them behind them with different colors of the pigmented cork dust there to push through. Textile workshops have always been an all hands on deck kind of scene from setup to takedown. This same relationship with tools and how we use them in a group setting to create pattern lives on today. Note the emerging pattern to the right where the arrow is pointing. The resulting speckled aesthetic of inlaid linoleum. In fiber and the sister fields of crafts of wood, glass, clay, and metal, it is common for a worker to have a specific kind of relationship with tools. If the tool doesn't exist, you make the tool to create the effect. Inventiveness is part of the creative process. I appreciated the images I found of designers fabricating the labor-intensive tools to make the pattern. These are hand soldered outlined print blocks. Note the motif repeating. This shows up, it's a repeat of 4 on one block, which minimizes how many times the block needed to be moved along the table in which the material was being made. The colorful residue remains from former print jobs. A closer look at what inlaid meant in terms of longevity of product. In some ways, you could consider this product is being made too well. No matter the amount of wear, there is no way the material will show damage over time because the print went all the way through. The other method for inlaid, sheets of color were die cut into shapes, puzzled back together again, and then baked into sheets to match orders. Again, I had a strong response to this picture too, because I sort of accidentally started working this way on my own desk. Known as mosaic linoleum, this was primarily a job given to women at the factories. Getting the chance to see these samples in person was particularly special for me because I could observe how something made so thoroughly falls apart. I am often in possession of the material after it has been broken, so to see it at this stage was really interesting. I'll be thinking about this for a long time. Here is a pattern book from Barry's Inlaid Linoleum of Kirkcaldy, showing how complex other patterns could be for assembly. Again, this would have been hand constructed. Another finding in the archive that really surprised me were the images found of what's known as the linoleum stove, a several-story tall vertical space where linoleum was hung to cure and bake over the course of several weeks at a particular temperature. Notice the tiny person in the back of this picture, how large this is. A room built for one job. This is a picture. So the last picture we were looking at is from the floor. If you look up to the top of this where it's hanging from, this is the other view looking down. Another view of the curing area with people for scale. My heart tosses completely for process-specific architecture. The quality control walk on the tables to check for buckling floors. Isn't this an amazing photograph? Found also in this archive, I was struck by the curious nature of these commemoratives of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. The depiction of the Queen made in honor of the year of her coronation out of a material that is supposed to be walked on. Note the shadows and usage of the jasp pattern for dimension. Now, I just want to point, can we all just observe, look at this with me, if you will, the shadow that's underneath her earring, the way that her eyebrows are made of more than one pattern, the fact that the necklace is an illusion of 3 parts. This is actually a really well-designed image, and the way these are made is really flawless. But I just was taken with the fact that it's made out of a material that it has different associations for people. These are like hiding in the archive in Kirkcaldy. As linoleum made its way to the United States, the beginning of what we can call a race to the bottom begins. Linoleum has an interesting relationship with the lowest common denominator of design. Each grade that gets thinner creates a cheaper product that more customers can afford. As the product becomes more popular, companies race to undercut one another in cheaper offerings to make bigger sales. The thickest sample on this card, shown at the top of the samples in the middle column, was called Battleship Linoleum for a reason. It was used to surface naval ships, believe it or not. Also, believe it or not, I did read that it was used to help hold the boat together, which seems unbelievable. Opinions of the time were not holding back. Architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable once wrote that the popularity of what she called, quote, substitute gimcrackery in the latter half of the 19th century was, quote, fueled by the American desire to find ways of doing things that were cheap, quick, and easy. Promising the moon in advertising. Two other quotes that are pretty fascinating here. Some manufacturers contended that it could wear for 60 years or more, and Armstrong maintained at one point that its product would, quote, last as long as the house. This other quote, to demonstrate its sturdiness, an exhibitor at the 1900 Paris Exposition went so far as to install inch-thick linoleum on a few driveways and courtyards as a road covering that would muffle the sounds of horse hooves and carriage wheels. So confident was he of success that he claimed to be negotiating with the French government to pave the entire Champs-Élysées with linoleum. The Armstrong Flooring Company of Lancaster, Pennsylvania would offer free training to floor mechanics who wanted to enter the trade. Please enjoy this amazing obstacle course room full of various flooring situations. This pattern's name changed over the years, but at Armstrong, it was regarded as the Christmas pattern. In the early years of the Depression, a layoff was expected. However, orders for the pattern unexpectedly took off and boosted production. The company was able to avoid the layoff in the end, suddenly able to give bonuses to its workers just in time for the holiday. The inlaid effect was made from workers sifting different colored mixtures onto the linoleum sheet in the process. The embossed effect was pressed in to suggest grout. This pattern had a long production life, showing in catalogs from 1935 to the mid-1990s. Armstrong re-released the pattern again in 2020. Linoleum went from here to here. Enter the era of marketing that aims specifically for a female audience. I will read here parts of this page because this article has a lot of words in it, but I want to read you some things of how they were, how the salesman would be trained to encounter the family that he's trying to get to buy this product. So what do you say to your customers? And quoted here, it says, let us suppose that one of your customers came into your store and looked at your display of linoleum. Her name is Mrs. Adams. The mailman who stops every day at the Adams front door can tell you that the Adams family must do a great deal of reading because Mr. Adams gets the Saturday Evening Post every week and Mrs. Adams subscribes to the Ladies' Home Journal and House and Garden. Mrs. Adams is interested not only in the fiction and in the more serious things these magazines contain, she pays almost as much attention to the advertisements because she wants to keep her home on Commonwealth Avenue, quote, up to the minute. In going through her magazines, she has been impressed again and again by the beautiful interiors shown in advertisements for Armstrong's linoleum. She wonders whether it is really true that such beautiful rooms are possible when linoleum is used as a floor. So she drops into your store to find out. Now remember when she comes to your store, she already knows something about linoleum. She has seen the patterns reproduced. She has read how linoleum should be laid, and she may have sent for one of the booklets that are offered in the advertisements. What is the subtext of what this is suggesting? 1, neighborhood culture draws conclusions from what little it can see from the outside. 2, marketing works particularly on impressionable women. 3, keeping up is the primary task of the budget-minded woman of the house. 4, she is educated but predictable. 5, the salesman is in control. All of this is a little dangerous, if you ask me. Using script for relatability and manipulation. She can do it in heels. These ads were often found in the Ladies' Home Journal. Nothing about this is easy, by the way. Why make something easy when you can make it impossible? Can we just take this in for a second? What's going on in this picture is an inlaid, I'm just gonna let you observe this for a second so you can think about what's happening right here. Worth it, obviously. My favorite found images of the factory production process. I just find this image of literally how vertical this factory is to be amazing. The product is moving through several floors to be made. The arrows here are pointing towards different factory workers at different points on the production line for one thing. Note how the process literally goes through the floor. Volume of material. Look at the size of that roll. A showroom I would completely lose my mind in. Can you imagine how colorful this would have been in person? Storage for days, now lost to time. My research continues from here stateside to explore more about what happened when Frederick Walton traveled to New York City to start again, fresh off the outcome of losing the exclusive rights to his own product's name. In 1872, he sails to New York City to start again, having been defeated by other Scottish industrialists, moving on with his product to establish the American Linoleum Manufacturing Company, the first producer in the United States. He spends 2 years supervising the building on Staten Island of a factory and its company town, which he named Linoleumville. In 1910, there were 6 firms making linoleum in the United States, including the companies of George Blabon and Thomas Potter in Philadelphia and the Cook's Company in New Jersey. And what came to dominate them all, the Armstrong Flooring Company of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We have a modest beginning of this in 1874. Just take a look at how much land is sitting around this. This is Staten Island we're looking at, to 1923, and an abundant factory town that was surrounding it. What am I thinking about now at this stage of the research? I came across these materials, these books, the trade books, where the chemistry had actually left its imprint on the preceding page. I'm probably going to end up making work about this at some point. Sometimes when you come across things you can't really explain, that's a moment where I would call like the double take thing is happening. Artists who in the room, you might recognize that feeling where you feel like you have to return to something because you're not done with it yet. This was one of those moments when I found this book. And then I found this book because the echo that's showing up on the other side of the page is really kind of profound. So I came looking for linoleum history and found a study of time and taste instead. The conclusions and reflections and questions that I'm still living with now are starting to affect the way that I'm making this work. In the midst of several projects, I have a tendency to multitask and work on 8 things at the same time. When I don't know how to answer one thing, I start something else. And then I start something else and I start something else. And eventually they start to talk to each other when I'm not there. And then when I come back, all of a sudden I have answers. Working in this kind of intuitive way is leading me to think about and reflect on the history of what I've seen. And it's now starting to affect the way that I'm like breaking and making my pieces. Continued research will help determine the future form this body of work takes. Thank you. So I think there might be a moment here where we can entertain questions both from the interwebs that are watching and from the room. So if you have any questions, I can field them at this time. I believe Karen's going to circulate with a microphone.
That is absolutely correct and beautifully summarized. I also want to mention or ask Christina to mention that she has brought some samples of her work.
Yes. On the table, for those in the room, I have a few fragments of pieces that are related to other pieces of artwork, some of which you saw pictures of. Whenever I'm making sculptural work, I have to make more than I need. In the case of breakage, when I install something, I took a really strong material and I made it frail by how I've handled it. So I always have a backup of supply that I can build back into the sculptures when they're shown in different places. So what you're looking at here are the replacements. And this is a fraction of how many more there are in Philadelphia, but it kind of gives you a sense of like how much work goes into the surface, and you would recognize the material because this is the same material you've probably pulled out of your house. So feel free to come up. You're welcome to handle them. You can touch them. They're here for that.
And Christina, I'm going to take some questions now, but I just want to first of all just thank you for that absolutely fascinating overview of linoleum and indeed your own work process.
Thank you.
But I see a gentleman over there, so I'm going to start here. And of course, our online audience, please feel free to submit your questions.
Yes, I will thank you too. That was wonderful. You may know, being from Philadelphia, that 30 years ago, a skyscraper was destroyed by linseed soaked rags that were left in the open air. I'm curious if you know how it is that oilcloth soaked with linseed oil was not itself a fire hazard.
That's an excellent question, and I do not have an answer for that. I think I wish I was able to see more of it in person. And when I had asked about that, because I was looking to really see like the origin of the linoleum, there is so little of it left in the facilities in Scotland that it was almost impossible to come by, which I think speaks volumes about degrading. Like it's literally not here to observe anymore. Yeah, I did not know that history. That's an interesting Philadelphia moment that I need to look into. Thank you for telling me that.
Meridian fire.
I will look for that. Thank you.
Thank you again.
This is why public talks are important.
I beg your pardon. What about marmoleum?
Marmoleum.
Marmoleum.
Well, actually, okay, so that is another variation of linoleum, as is Congoleum. Some of you might have heard that name also. Different parallel products. Again, I was only studying linoleum, as in like the jute-backed linoleum. I have a lot more research to dig into, depending on where it takes me. I'm really interested in the transition to the vinyl flooring, because I feel like what I have encountered largely in the United States is vinyl flooring impersonating linoleum. But yes, I do not, I'm sorry, I don't have any information on linoleum.
Thank you.
Another in-person question?
I'm just curious, in an old farmhouse that I spent some time in my youth, I believe we had linoleum floors that were made to look like rugs.
Yes.
And old newspaper was under them, similar to wallpapers where you find old Yiddish newspaper under it. And I'm just wondering if that was part of installation to put newspaper under it.
Well, in my own experience of demolishing walls in South Philadelphia, we found that behind plaster, it's a way for, I mean, I observed it as a way for it to insulate the floor, but also to hold the floor, to tack the tacking of it. I don't know. I haven't come across any explanation for why that would have been the case, but I've seen it behind plaster. So my sense is that it has to do with insulation and holding the material down with adhesive. Yes.
Right. I'm going to take an online question.
Oh, sure.
Is actual linoleum being made in the USA now, and is it still sold?
My understanding is that the Armstrong Flooring Company is still going strong. I, however, have to cross-check exactly if that's true with Armstrong. Armstrong has kind of a industrial curtain in front of it online. It's very hard to get historical information actually from them. A lot of my information has come through fragment observation and archives. So I've been looking at the much older versions, but according to things I've come across, they are still producing and bringing back patterns from a long time ago.
Very good to know.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a question from this gentleman.
Yes.
One point I want to make about, as you pointed out with the linoleum, it heals very well, right?
Mm.
It also transfers the floor below, telegraphs through. Most of the time people had regular floors, 2-inch, wooden flooring.
Mm-hmm.
Modern installations put in plywood in order to give you a plane.
Mm-hmm.
In the day when 1935, when linoleum arrived in your home, people would put that paper down to ameliorate that transfer of the pattern of what's underneath to come through. If you look at old linoleum, you'll see it all the time. You see the cracks running, they telegraph right through.
Yes. Telegraphing is a beautiful word to describe that. Thank you.
Christina, thank you. When you were growing up, because it's just this is a passion, you're consumed with the topic. Were there any early indications as a growing up that you'd take these things on? Like, were you that kid in school who just the curious kid?
Okay, my family happens to be in attendance at this talk, so I'm going to speak about them for a second. Thank you all for being here. I come from a family of that takes great care in the homes that they live in. And by this, I mean, my father, bless his heart, loved to paint and repaint the trim to keep it fresh in the house. Keeping fresh paint, keeping the coatings clean. Like there's something about coating things to make them cleaner, but also losing the profiles in the process that I observed as a child. It's had a deep influence on me as an artist. I think there's a lot of history that's pushed into the walls and on the floor when you are sort of excessively taking care of things or saving them for later. I think we kind of embed ourselves into our homes in that way because we're literally painting our own histories in. So I think about that a lot, like how that overpainting things, closing them off, sealing them shut, constructing things on a seam line that closes actually comes from that vocabulary of living in a house that took that really seriously. So, Dad, thanks.
Well, that's wonderful to know that inspiration was passed on. I'm going to take another question from the online audience. This is from Alison Samuels. How does linoleum degrade? Does it turn to dust?
Well, I know that as I'm working it pretty hard in my studio, even as I'm breaking it down, it falls apart in a way that is somewhat gummy and brittle at the same time. I don't think it'll ever return to dust because the linseed oil is doing a spectacular job of keeping it bound together. As far as like breaking it down, it's made of this composite, even though the original version of linoleum was actually an organic mixture of material, it is made so well that it's going to take forever for it to actually completely fall apart. So I don't know if any of us will be around long enough to see it completely fall apart because it was made too well to begin with.
Okay. I'm going to take a question over here.
To that point, exact point, it was so fascinating to see how artisanal the process was and how artistic, frankly, and honestly. I mean, I thought of it to the extent I ever thought about linoleum was that it was extruded, you know?
Yeah.
Do you think it'll ever come back in vogue because it is artisanal and there could be this kind of weird interest in it that would resurface it as an industry?
That's an interesting question. I think the requirement of how complicated the processing was to make it in that way is so completely unreasonable for the way materials are produced today. I mean, if anything, I think it would be a translation of how that's done. It takes almost like a devout level of loyalty to the process to do it the authentic way. I mean, here I work into my materials when you'll feel this when you walk up to these, that it goes past a reasonable point of handling something. I'm kind of interested in spending artistically an amount of time that is too long because it emphasizes something. When you work back into material in that type of way, it emphasizes and underlines something that's really common so many times until it kind of tips into being profound. That's where I'm going with, as an artist who's not restricted by the boundaries of production or the requirement of thinking about like how to bring it back or to make it again. Those are things that I'm thinking about. I think though that in the actual production of it, it does kind of come back to that quote, the 1905 quote that says that you have to be okay with it not being spectacular. I don't know. I think that might still be a thing. Because that what was really incredible about that quote is that it assumes that the public has no taste, but it also suggests to the designer that they should play to that and lean in. And I think that's actually not over. There's a lot of that going on now. So that's an interesting question. My aspiration is that my talking about it in front of this group might resurrect some enthusiasm for it or like a respect for how things have been made. Because this is super hard to do, as you can see.
No idea.
Yeah, it blew my mind that when I saw that photograph of the women piecing it together, I just couldn't believe that had ever been an idea to begin with. It's beautiful to me for that reason.
Right, I'm going to take a sort of a related question to that you've partly addressed, but if you wouldn't mind expanding that, do you feel that linoleum is still popular today, particularly in kitchens? This is from Judith Rice online.
That's a good question because it does a really awesome job of being able to be easily cleaned and the water resistant half of it. I mean, its performance is sort of off the charts for that job. However, rarely see it in homes anymore unless somebody has a loyalty to the original style of a home. The way they buy it is how they leave it if they want to keep it in that sort of time capsule place. But yeah, I wish it would come back. But I again, like, tastes change over time and the public has a strong impact on whether these companies will produce them anymore.
Well, Christina, I feel like you're a one-person ambassador for linoleum. So yeah.
Yes.
Do we have any more in-person questions? I think this might be a family
Question
member,
from the
possibly.
family.
A friend mentioned to me that there was a time when asbestos was part of linoleum.
Yes.
And I wanted to know how you protect yourself when you're doing your pieces from any threat.
Okay, I knew that question was going to come from the audience. Thanks, Mom. Okay, so my the asbestos was added as a form of fire retardant to the material. As we know that that's not something that you should handle casually in any way. The way that I handle this is that when I come across it, either through somebody's demolition or finding it, out of context in a junkyard, I take samples of it and I send it to a lab that happens to test for asbestos in South Jersey. There are labs that exist all over the place like this. And the moral of the story is that if you ever encounter this, you should absolutely send it to a lab to have a special type of test done to see if there are traces of asbestos in it. So that's how I answer that question for myself. For the safety of my own working practice in my studio, I test everything before I use it because you don't know if it's out of context and it appear. And also I should cross-reference that the homework that I've done in these different archives helped me somewhat date the patterns that I've encountered to know if it was 1935 or 1945, 1975. I mean, there are obvious style shifts that happen where you can kind of place like where it would have fallen. But literally I've come across designs that are basically like, I'll put it this way, 2 desks over in the same shop, meaning that there would have been like a particular catalog for a certain year made, of which they put out one every year for the companies. That's what I came across, was that you'd see 1935, 36, 37, 38, and you'd see that most of the patterns that were doing really well were lasting, or new ones would be put in with a different palette, subtle shifts. And I was able to actually locate that some of the ones that I've worked with fall under the category of 1945 from Armstrong in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So there is a way to kind of backwards, like in a backwards manner, kind of date them. And then you can sort of deduce from there if the chances are higher, if asbestos would have been involved or not. But I do test everything to be safe.
Very good to know. We'll just take a few more questions. I'm going to mention a couple of online. One is a point of information. Could you repeat the name of the author of Quick, Cheap and Easy? And that's from Evie.
The name is Pamela H. Simpson. She's an art historian. And if for anybody that might be familiar with Winterthur down in Delaware, she was a Winterthur Fellow, I believe in 1991. And a date before that, she was there twice. And then she wrote a whole book on this. So you can find her in the archive if you look. Pamela H. Simpson.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is from M. Cell. Does Linoleumville still exist?
No, Linoleumville's name was changed to Travis, Staten Island, because the residents couldn't take it anymore. I don't know what year that happened. That's actually the next chapter of research I would like to complete, is to actually go find the historical societies and to talk with them in Staten Island about these questions of the companies that were there, because I would love to know more about that specifically.
Right. We're going to take 2 more questions. I've seen 2 people who put their hand. Well, okay, 3 more questions. I'm sorry it's all on this side. I'm sorry.
The sample that you showed, and I think it was Armstrong that brought back that pattern in 2020.
Yeah.
I think so.
The
That
Christmas pattern. Yeah.
yeah, that Christmas pattern, which is it was embossed,
Mhm.
or I guess is embossed,
Mhm.
and it has that different coloration, like that tiled effect. So obviously that's not pieced together individually anymore.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So is that almost like a printing process? Like, how do they do that?
That's an interesting question, because they would have to reverse engineer the effect to make it simulate what it was doing to begin with. Because if we look back at this picture, let me see if I can get back to this. Should be back here. You'll see that the tables that they are sitting at, or standing at rather, they're mashing. They're pushing the cork dust through the zinc frame in this picture, which was the origin of how it was made. This presents a really interesting problem for textile design and textile process in a way, even though we're talking about resilient flooring here, of reverse engineering effect after you make it happen one way, you have to figure out how to simulate it again. There actually are articles that you can find online specifically about this pattern and the way that they reproduced it for today's manufacturing, which would be interesting to look into following this talk. So I would suggest looking that up.
And in that photograph, like, how are they keeping the colors in just individual cells, like when they do that?
Well, I think I would assume in this picture, the way that this is going is that they're dropping one color and letting it cure and bake in place. And then they go through the whole process again with another color registered to the repeat. So if you've ever seen anybody do textile printing at a table, there's stages that you move through where you drop one color at a time, go through a drying process, and then you go back to the beginning and do the same process again, adding what we call a different registration to the same print that's still attached to the table, which is essentially what you're looking at here. But what we're looking at in this picture is definitely one pass of color. I wish there was footage, but this is from a moment in time when there probably was no video taken. So.
Right, we're going to take our final two questions, and the two people who put their hand with over here, okay? And then we'll go over to you, sir.
First, thank you so much. This is great. So I've grown up in Brooklyn and spent a lot of time in central Pennsylvania, and I'm love of historic houses, and I've been to many. I'm curious about the origin of why it was created and the idea of the pixelation of how it was mimicking like the actual rugs. I've seen it in many times where it was laid on top of as an area rug. Was that the former incarnation of it? Or was it originally designed to be wall to wall? Or was it originally designed to just mimic like an area rug? And was part of that to be, the second part of that is, was part of it to be designed, possibly if it was in a kitchen or something, to be cleaner, like you can clean it easier? And what period of time would it have been laid like a rug?
My encounter with when it was used as a rug sort of hits like a Victorian era. I kept coming across a particular phrase that I didn't understand what the word meant, because it's sort of a word that's lost to time and design. And it's escaping me right now. I'm glad you asked this question though, because it had to do specifically with the way you would enter a home, a Victorian home, and how there would have been a sort of vestibule area before you actually enter the main house. And because of its waterproof nature, it would have been used as a rug to sort of take the outside off of your shoes as you're entering the home. So in that particular area, there was a specific type of architecture or an area of space that would have been common enough for somebody to put this particular shape down that I'm thinking of, that I'm talking to. And it's listed as that way in archives. If you're looking for linoleums and you're looking for Victorian era linoleum, you will come across this word, which of course I'm forgetting right now, which matches that area of the house as a point of entry. So to answer this, what I'm trying to say is that it would have been used as like an area rug to begin with, but I think the idea of going all the way to the walls came into play largely because they were trying to pitch it as like a germicidal floor. It's like this, it was safe in your nursery, it was safe in your kitchen, in your bathroom to clean very easily. I mean, I also sort of line a lot of this up with the turn of, early 1900s, and we're looking at what type of pandemics were happening at that time. It's actually very interesting that linoleum kind of presented itself or started pitching itself as a safe version of flooring that you didn't have to worry about germs coming into your home or getting captured inside textiles that would be on the floor. So I wish I could remember the word that I have this object that I'm thinking of, but I have come across that where it was used as an area rug, but as oilcloth. That's what I'm speaking to. It's oilcloth, not linoleum. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And to our final question.
Thank you so much for the talk. I had a question. You brought up a very fascinating slide that was, I think, a salesman sample, or the little box with all the vials. And you mentioned some sort of technical advancement that would allow for more variety of colors.
Yes.
What types of pigments would they use to make these colors?
All right, that's an interesting question because I don't have an answer to that. I don't know exactly how they were getting, because it's abstract. The word pigment is a little abstract. I don't exactly know myself exactly what those pigments were made from, but the white vial that you were looking at there in the fourth in, that was the oxidized linseed material, which enabled the full palette of the rainbow to be used, which made such a huge difference in the product offerings, because if you remember at the early end of this presentation, the Camptulicon, if you think about that material as having a brown base, automatically the rainbow put on top of it will never glow the same type of way. And to start with a white base changes everything. I mean, I'm sure those flooring pieces were actually really beautiful too, because of that ambered nature that would have come through because it was sitting on brown material. But there's something about the color white as being a starting point that changes things. And I think that that catered to the crowd that they were trying to sell to. So I wish I had a better answer for that pigment question. Again, more research to be done. Thank you for asking that question.
Christina, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And
Thank you.
you did so much research.
Yes.
It's been so much appreciated. So thank you so much. We are so delighted that you came up from Philadelphia to share your inspiration, your expertise, your research, and your beautiful, beautiful artwork.
Thank
And
you.
we so appreciate you being a really vital part of our artisan lecture series. So thank you so much, Christina.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And to say a few additional words, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Victoria Dingle.
Well, yes, Christina, to add to Karen's, thank you. I was thinking throughout the whole lecture how lucky your students are because of your teaching style. You really do your research. You're meticulous, really.
That's true.
You're meticulous and entertaining. You have a
Thank you.
sense of humor. That's important
Thanks.
and always appreciated. And so thank you for presenting this. And I was also thinking, if like years ago you started a list, we should help our audience develop an appreciation for fill in the blanks. I honestly would have never thought about linoleum, but I was really happy when you proposed it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you to our audience, as always, our online and our in-person audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So in conclusion, I am just going to quickly mention some of our upcoming lectures. We have French upholstery, then and now, with the master artisan Bruno Lopez, and that's on Thursday, April 13th. We have Heaven on the Hudson, Mansions, Monuments, and Marvels of Riverside Park with Stephanie Arizoni on Tuesday, April 18th. And the Magnificent Bridges of New York City with Dave Frieder on Tuesday, April 25th. But for the moment, I want to extend our great appreciation and thanks for the really fabulous presentation, Christina. So thank you so much. Thank you to our online audience. Thank you to our in-person audience, who I hope will also join us for a glass of wine. Oh, and one more thing, we do have a little presentation for you, a little memento of the evening, the poster.
Thank you. So nice.
Thank you all very much. Please join us for a glass of wine. Thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to come up and handle the material that's on the table here. You can come feel it.